When you ask someone to name a Lionhead Studios game, they will undoubtedly say Fable, because Fable is the most famous series that the studio has ever made. The most prolific, the one that had the most sales, the one that was marketed the most, and the one that killed it. Few people will actually mention a game called The Movies, which was developed by Lionhead in the year 2005. 11 years ago. Well, 11 years minus a few months because it was November. Do you remember the time when people would release Tycoon games in November? Do you remember the time when people would release Tycoon games in general? Probably not. The Movies is a Tycoon game, as you may have ascertained, but it's also a special kind of game that is part of a certain group of titles, ones that were released too soon. And I don't mean released too soon because it had too many bugs in it and could have used more QA, more patching. No. Not that kind of released too soon. Not the every game Joe would release in its final years type of too soon, but another kind. The kind you would see in games like System Shock. That game was released too soon, not only because it was contemporary with Doom 2, but also because the first version of it was on floppy disks, and on those disks you couldn't fit the audio, the voices. And a lot of people missed out on those. And The Movies was a game that was released too soon, but not because of any technical issue. It was good just the way it was. As a game, it is solid, fantastic even, I love it. I would really enjoy playing it more if I actually had the time to do so. The Movies was released too soon from a cultural standpoint. Do you know what else happened in 2005? Actually, I believe in November 2005. A startup called YouTube received a few $1 million in funding in order to help it expand and become a better service. A year later, it would become actually a very popular service to upload videos. And in that time, The Movies did receive an expansion. And do you know what that expansion didn't do? Because it couldn't? It didn't add any sort of YouTube integration. At that time, YouTube wasn't the behemoth we see now that has integration in just about everything. It had integration in Grid 2. I could upload my sick power slides right into the web. But that was quite recently. In 2005 and 2006, hell, any time before 2009 I guess, YouTube wasn't as huge for gaming as it is, well, now. And therefore, The Movies, this precise game that could have benefited the most from something like YouTube, never got a chance to take advantage of it properly. Now a sequel could have. A sequel made somewhere around 2007 to 2009 could have used this system perfectly, but that sequel was impossible to make. The Movies was published by Activision, and by 2006, Lionhead would become the studio that brought you Fable and nothing else. It was a Microsoft company, no longer able to work on projects for other publishers like Activision. So, what was The Movies? As I've said, it was a tycoon, but it was a very different one. It was one that let you create your own movies. It had an editor that let you create your own scenes with your own camera angles. Well, in the expansion you could do that with canned animation, with whatever props you wanted, with different outcomes to different scenes. You could chain them all together and make a movie. You could even add your own dialogue, your own audio, your own filters. It had stunts in the expansions. It had different sets. It had different lighting conditions. It had special effects. This game had it all. And most importantly, it was dead simple to use. Now, you couldn't manipulate the animations of the characters. You couldn't make them do exactly what you wanted, exactly the way you wanted. You had those canned animations. So you couldn't actually do, in theory, something as complex as you can in Source Filmmaker. But whereas Source Filmmaker takes you a few weeks to learn to actually properly use, this one took you 5 minutes, and in that time you already had a movie out. Not a long one, but you had a movie. And the variety of those sequences was downright amazing. You had stuff for horror movies, sci-fi, action movies, comedies. You had just about everything you wanted to make a movie. You could edit it the way you wanted it. You could give it titles. You could give it your own audio, your own voice, voicing each character. You could have more people voicing characters. You could have an actual movie. And then you could render that out in the Windows Media Video format and post it online for other people to see. Or if they had the game, you could just give them the movie file, which was only a few kilos. Not the 30 or 40 or maybe even 100 megabytes that the maximum quality renderer could actually put out. In 2005, 100 megabytes to upload would have been a nightmare. Now, well, for me, now 100 megabytes is, well, it's uploaded by the time I finish the sentence. That component of creating a movie was what made the movies absolutely unique. And yet, the rest of it was still a fine game. As a tycoon, as a management game, I would say it is on par with some of the best of them like Roller Coaster Tycoon. And you didn't just have to balance the finances of a movie studio. You also had to balance to manage your stars because they tended to go a bit nuts if you worked them too hard. They could become alcoholics, you had to send them to rehab, they would fight with each other. They would behave like The Sims would. And that created a very interesting dynamic, where you would have to cater to your stars, and at the same time try and not let them boss you around, because you are still the head of the studio, and those people belonged to you. Now this may sound like slavery, but this game is one of those historical games that I love so much. Because you started out in the era of the mute films, you did start out in the era where owning actors was an actual thing. Where if you were part of a studio, you were part of that studio. It was your life's blood. The only way you would get out of it is either by someone firing you because they didn't like you and didn't hate you enough to have you killed, or because you died. Contracts were ironclad back then. Escaping them was not something people did lightly. And being a historical game, starting out in the era of the silent films, it let you understand how movies evolved. It let you see and experience from where they started to where they ended up. You started from humble beginnings with cameras that were basically awful, they shot very bad video, you didn't have any sound, you mainly had slapstick comedies, and then you evolved to very janky, bizarre, kooky sci-fi sets and westerns and monster movies. And technology would get better and better every year. It would unlock new possibilities for you. You would unlock new ways to promote your movies. You had PR, you had marketing, you had press tours, you had television interviews. You had it all at your disposal. Well, yes, you could start with everything unlocked if you didn't want to go through the whole passage of time thing, but if you did, how shall I put this? Games that let you experience history as it happened, or approximately as it happened, hold a special place for me, because those people went through the effort to actually try and teach you history, to actually try and teach you about a subject and show it to you as it evolved. In this aspect, you could call the movies an educational game. Well, no, not just in this aspect. Making the movie, understanding how to edit a movie in this game can actually be good training for when you decide to become a video editor, because they're mostly the same tools. There's cut, paste, fade in, fade out, mess around with other settings. Well, no, it won't teach you the shortcuts, the exact process, because that's different for every software, but it does teach you the flow of a scene. It does teach you to try and build something that's natural, something that works. And how can you not appreciate a game for trying to do that? For trying to teach you both the history of movies and how to actually make one. This is, I would say, quite rare, because what other games can actually teach you a skill that you can use in the real world that relates to its subject? Honestly, off the top of my head, I can only think of one, and that would be Colobot, which was a programming game where you could program robots to do various tasks instead of having your character do them manually. And that game taught you programming, a very useful skill to have. This game taught you video editing, and yet they were both games, both very good games. What other games do this, I wonder? Boy, that sure sounds like a good subject for next week's Gaming Cult. I'd love to tell you to just go out and buy the movies because it's probably on GOG for $9 or $10, but it's not. It used to be on Steam. I believe it was removed because the options in the menus would no longer work. Well, some of them, because they were tied to an online service which Lionhead had set up for the distribution of videos, which isn't available anymore because they didn't use YouTube, because YouTube wasn't real that great back then, and I believe that's why it was removed, though I'm not sure. That's what I read on Steam forums, based on what the public thought, and it would probably be very wrong actually. It may actually have to do with the license of it. Maybe they split it between Lionhead and Activision and Microsoft, and something exploded. So you can't actually buy it unless you're on a Mac. I have no idea. Maybe it's to reinforce the stereotype that, well, you have a Mac, it's probably the best thing ever for video editing. It's not. But for some insane reason, Gamersgate sells this for the Mac at 15 euros, well 16 euros actually, but not for Windows. Not for Windows or Linux. And that's a shame. That's a crying shame. But if you do find it on some weird, obscure corner of the internet that we don't talk about, play it. If you're a fan of movies, play it. If you're a fan of history, play it. If you're not at all interested in movies or history, still play it, because you just may end up learning something. If you enjoyed this show, hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Or, if you thought it was horrible, then share it with your enemies and make them suffer. We shall be your weapon of vengeance. But if you liked what you saw, you could, I don't know, maybe donate, because basically YouTube is horrible at revenue, by using the link in the description, or just buy my book. It's a fantasy book about, well, a lot of stuff. I guarantee it won't suck, and if it does suck, you can find me here and complain about it.